Gotcha. Get into it. Get into it. Yes. We're back. Hi. Hi, lovelies. Welcome back to Storytime with Chris. As I always say, you don't have to watch these videos when they go live. You're more than welcome to watch them in your downtime, nap time, max, relax, and chillaxing time. In between time, eat time, scheme time, study time, break time, CP time, anytime that you want to hear a highly animated voice bring you wonderful stories of magic, fantasy, science fiction, adventure, and many, many more in between. Hi, lovelies. Welcome back. Let's go ahead and get started. Now, the last time we were here, the Baudelaire children, Sunny, Klaus, and Violet, have just been given their new assignment. They have to figure out who is the imposter that is writing stuff under Jacques Snicket's name, or whether or not it's actually Jacques Snicket himself for some reason. Because if you remember from the Vile Village, Jacques Snicket was accused of murder and was accused of being Count Olaf, and he was supposed to be burned at the stake, but ended up being killed in his prison cell, and we never got an answer as to how it happened, but we can all allude that more than likely Count Olaf was the one who did it. At least that's the assumption that we make. So let's go ahead and get started. And no, I don't own the music that you're listening to in the background, which is brought to you by Mr. Aviance. Go ahead and share some love. Give them a like, a subscription, and even check out their Patreon, Mr. Ambiance. Yes. Chapter 3. There are places where the world is quiet, but the enormous lobby of the Hôtel Denouement was not one of them. On the day the Baudelaires walked up the stairs through the White Frog from the funnel and entered the large curved archway named Entrance, or when reflected in the enormous pond, Entrance, the lobby was bustling with activity. As Kit Snicket had predicted, the Baudelaires were able to pass unnoticed in the hotel because everyone was far too busy to notice anything. Guests were lined up in front of a huge reception desk, which for some reason had the number 101 emblazoned on the wall above it, so they could check into the hotel and go to their rooms to freshen up. Excuse me. Bellboys and bellgirls were loading piles of luggage onto carts and rolling them towards the elevators, which for some reason had the number 118 emblazoned on the doors, so they could drop off the suitcases in the guest rooms and collect their tips. Waiters and waitresses were bringing food and drink to people who were sitting on the chairs and benches of the lobby waiting for refreshment. Taxi drivers were ushering guests into the lobby to join the line, and dogs were dragging their owners out of the lobby to take walks. There we go. Now you can see my head as I turn. It's not going to cut me off. Confused tourists were standing around looking quizzically at maps, and rambunctious children were playing hide-and-seek among the potted plants. A man in a tuxedo was sitting at a grand piano emblazoned with the number 152 playing tinkly tunes to amuse anyone who cared to listen, and members of the cleaning staff were discreetly polishing the green wooden floors etched with the number 123 for anyone who cared to see their feet reflected with every step. There was an enormous fountain in one corner of the room releasing a cascade of water that ran over the number 131 in a shiny smooth wall, and there was an enormous woman in the opposite corner standing under the number 176 and shouting a man's name over and over in an increasingly annoyed tone of voice. The Baudelaires tried to be flat ears as they walked across the chaos of the lobby, but there was so much to observe and all of it was moving so quickly that they wondered how they could even get started on their noble errand. I had no idea this place would be so busy, Violet said, blinking at the lobby from behind her sunglasses. How in the world will we be able to observe the imposter, Klaus wondered, among all these possible suspects? Frank first, Sunny said. Sunny's right, Violet said. The first step in our errand should be locating our new employer. If we saw our signal from that open window, he should be expecting us. Unless his villainous brother Ernest is expecting us instead, Klaus said. Or both, Sunny said. Why do you suppose there are so many numbers? Violet started to ask, but before she could finish her question, a man came bounding up to them. He was very tall and skinny, and his arms and legs stuck out at odd angles as if he were made of drinking straws instead of flesh and bone. He was dressed in a uniform similar to that of the Baudelaires, but with the word manager printed in fancy script over one of the pockets of his coat. You must be the new concierges, he said. Welcome to the Hôtel Denouement. I'm one of the managers. Frank? Violet asked. Or Ernest? Exactly. the man said and winked at them. I'm so happy the three of you are here, even if one of you is unusually short, because we're unusually short-handed. I'm so busy you'll have to figure out the system for yourselves. System? Klaus asked. This place is as complicated as it is enormous, said Frank, or perhaps Ernest, and vice versa. I'd hate to think what would happen if you didn't understand it. The Baudelaires looked carefully at their new manager, but his face was utterly unfathomable, a word which here means blank. So the Baudelaires could not tell if he was giving them a friendly warning or a sinister threat. We'll try our best, Violet said quietly. Good, said the manager, leading the children across the enormous lobby. You'll be our guests, beck and call. He continued, using a phrase which meant that the guests would be boss around the Baudelaires as well. If anyone and everyone standing here asks for assistance, you'll immediately volunteer to help them. Excuse me, sir, interrupted one of the bellboys. He was holding a suitcase in each and wearing a confused expression on his face. This luggage arrived in a taxi, but the driver said the guests wouldn't arrive until Thursday. What should I do? Thursday? Said Frank or Ernest with a frown. Excuse me, concierges. I don't suppose I have to tell you how important this is. I'll be right back. The manager followed the bellboy into the crowd, leaving the Baudelaire standing alone next to a large wooden bench marked with the number 128. Klaus ran his hand along the bench, which was etched with rings from people setting down glasses without using coasters. Do you think we were talking to Frank? Klaus said, or Ernest? I don't know, Violet said. He used the word volunteer. Maybe that was some sort of code. There's interest, Sonny said, which meant he knew that Thursday was important. That's true, Klaus said, but it is important to him because he's a volunteer or a villain. Before either Baudelaire sister could haphazard a guess, a phrase which here means attempt to answer Klaus's question, the tall, skinny man reappeared at their sides. You must be the new concierges, he said. And the children realized that this was the other brother. Welcome to the Hotel Denouement. You must be Ernest, Violet tried. Or Frank, Sonny said. Yes, said the manager, although it was not at all clear with whom he was agreeing. I'm very grateful you three are here. The hotel is quite busy at the moment, and we're expecting more guests to arrive on Thursday. Now, you'll be stationed at the concierge desk number 175, right over here. Follow me. The children followed him to the far wall of the lobby where a large wooden desk sat under the number 175, which was painted over an enormous window. On the desk was a small lamp shaped like a frog, and out the window the children could see the gray flat horizon of the sea. We've got a pond on one side of us, said Frank, unless of course it was Ernest, and the sea on the other side. It doesn't sound very safe, and yet some people think this is a very safe place indeed. Frank, unless it was Ernest, looked around hurriedly and lowered his voice. What do you think? Once again, the manager's face was unfathomable, and the children could not tell if his reference to a safe place made him a volunteer or a villain. Sonny said, which is often a safe answer, even though it is not really an answer at all. Frank or Ernest said in response. Now then, let me explain how this hotel is organized. Excuse me, sir, said a male girl whose face could not be seen behind the pile of newspapers she was carrying. The latest edition of the Daily Punctilio has arrived. Let me see, said either Ernest or Frank, plucking a copy from the top of the pile. I heard that Geraldine Julien has written an update on the Baudelaire case. The Baudelaire orphans froze, scarcely daring to look at one another, let alone the volunteer villain who was standing beside them reading the headline aloud. Baudelaire's rumored to return to the city, he said. According to information recently discovered by this reporter when opening a cookie, Veronica Clyde and Susie Baudelaire. The notorious murders of renowned actor Count Omar are returning to the city, perhaps to commit more vicious murders or to continue their recent hobby of arson. Citizens are advised to watch out for these three bloodthirsty children and to report them to the authorities if they are spotted. If they are not spotted, citizens are advised to do nothing. The manager turned to the Baudelaires, his face as unfathomable as ever. What do you think of that, concierges? That's an interesting question, Klaus replied, which is another very safe answer. I'm glad you find it interesting, Ernest or Frank replied, which was equally safe answer to Klaus's safe answer. Then he turned to the bell girl. I'll show you the newsstand in room 168, he said, and disappeared with the newspapers into the crowd, leaving the Baudelaires alone, standing at the desk and staring out to sea. I think that was Ernest, Violet said. His comment about the hotel's safety sounded very sinister. But he did seem alarmed by the story in the Daily Punctilio, Klaus said. If Ernest is an enemy of VFD, he'd have been on the watch for us. So that man was probably Frank. Maybe he just didn't recognize us, Violet said. After all, few people recognize Count Olaf when he's in disguise. And his disguises aren't much better than ours. Maybe we look more like concierges than Baudelaires. Or maybe we don't look like Baudelaires at all, Klaus said. As Kit said, we're not children anymore. Ridiculous, Sunny said, which meant something like, I think I'm still a child. That's true, Klaus admitted, smiling down at his sister, but the older we get, the less likely it is that we'll be recognized. That should make it easier to do our errands, Violet said. What do you mean by that? Asked a familiar voice, and the Baudelaire saw that either Frank or Ernest had returned. What my associate meant, Klaus said, thinking quickly, is that it would be easier for us to start our work as concierges if you explained how the hotel is organized. I just said I would do that, said Frank in an annoyed voice, or Ernest in an irritated one. Once you understand how the Hotel Denouement works, you'll be able to perform your errands as easily as you would find a book in a library. And if you can find a book in the library, then you already know how this hotel works. Expound, which is really good for Sunny to say. That's an excellent word for a now 6-year-old? Yes, 6-year-old. I should have brought a handkerchief. Goodness. The Hotel Denouement is organized according to the Dewey Decimal System, which is something I'm really familiar with from my days of continually going to the library. And the library, to an extent, still uses the Dewey Decimal System in their cataloging books and reference material. That's the same way books are organized in many libraries. For instance, if you wanted to find a book on German poetry, you could begin in the section of the library marked 800, which contains books on literature and rhetoric. Similarly, the 8th story of this hotel is reserved for our rhetorical guests. Within the 800 section of a library, you'd find books on German poetry labeled 831, and if you're able to take the elevator up to the 8th story and walk into room 831, you'd find a gathering of German poets. Understand? I think so, said Klaus. All three Baudelaires had spent enough time in libraries to be familiar with the Dewey Decimal System, but even Klaus's vast experience in research did not mean he had committed the entire system to memory. It is not necessary, of course, to memorize the Dewey Decimal System in order to use a library, as most libraries have catalogs, in which all the books are listed on cards or on a computer screen to make them easier to find. Where can we find the catalog for the Hotel Denouement services? Catalog? Repeated either Frank or Ernest. You shouldn't need a catalog. The entire 100 section of a library is dedicated to philosophy and psychology, and so is the first story of our hotel. From the reception desk, which is labeled 101 for the theory of philosophy, to the concierge desk, which is labeled 175 for the ethics of recreation and leisure, to the couches over there, which are labeled 135 for dreams and mysteries, in case our guests want to take a nap or conceal something underneath the sofa cushions. The second story is the 200s for religion, and we have a church, a cathedral, a chapel, a synagogue, a mosque, a temple, a shrine, a shuffleboard court, and room 2296, which is currently occupied by a somewhat cranky rabbi. The third story is the social sciences, where we have placed our ballrooms and meeting rooms. The fourth story is dedicated to language, so most of our foreigners stay there. The 500s are dedicated to mathematics and science, and the sixth story is dedicated to technology, from the sauna in room 613, which stands for the promotion of health, to room 697, which is where we keep the controls for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. Now, if the seventh story stands for the arts, what do you think we would find in room 792, which stands for stage presentations? Violet wanted to tie her hair up in a ribbon to help her think, but she was afraid of being recognized. A theater? She said. You've obviously visited a library before, the manager said, although the children could not tell if he was complimenting them or getting suspicious. I'm afraid that's not true of all of our guests, so when they're in need of any of our services, they ring for a concierge instead of wandering around the hotel by themselves. In the next day or so, you'll probably walk through every section of the hotel, from the astronomy observatory in room 999 to the employees' quarters in the basement, room 000. Is that where we'll sleep? Klaus asked. Well, you're on duty 24 hours a day, Ernest said, or perhaps it was Frank. But the hotel gets very quiet at night. When the guests go to sleep or stay up all night reading, you can nap behind the desk, and when someone rings for you, it will serve as an alarm clock. Frank stopped talking, or perhaps it was Ernest, and quickly looked around the room before leaning in close to the Baudelaires. The three siblings nervously looked back at Ernest through their sunglasses. Or maybe it was Frank. Your positions as concierges, he said, in an unfathomable tone, are excellent opportunities for you to quietly observe your surroundings. People tend to treat the hotel staff as if they're invisible, so you'll have the chance to see and hear quite a lot of interesting things. However, you should remember that you will always have many opportunities to be observed. Do I make myself clear? This time it was Violet who needed to give a safe answer. She said. That's an interesting question. Either Frank or Ernest narrowed his eyes at the oldest Baudelaire and seemed about to say something, but the Baudelaire suddenly heard some loud, piercing, ringing sounds. Aha! The manager cried. Your work has begun! The siblings followed Ernest or Frank around to the other side of the desk, and Frank or Ernest pointed to a vast network of tiny bells, each no longer than a thimble, which lined the back of a desk where knobs for drawers might otherwise be. Each bell had a number on it, from 000 to 999, with one extra bell that had no number at all. This extra bell was ringing along with the bell number 371 and the bell number 674. Ring! Cried either Ernest or Frank. Ring! I shouldn't have to tell you, the bell's your signal. We can't keep our guests waiting for an instant. You can tell which guest is ringing by the number on the bell. If the number written on the bell was 469, for example, you would know that one of our Portuguese guests required assistance. Are you paying attention? The bell marked 674 indicates our associates are in the lumber industry, as the number 674 means lumber processing or wood products. In the Dewey Decimal System, we can't make enemies out of our important guests. The number 374 indicates educational guests. Please be nice to them too, although they are much less important. Respond to all of our guests whenever you hear that ring. But what does that unmarked bell refer to? Klaus asked. The Dewey Decimal System doesn't go higher than 999. The manager frowned as if the middle Baudelaire had given him the wrong answer. That's the rooftop sunbathing salon, he said. People who sunbathe aren't usually interested in library science, so they're not picky about the salon's location. Now get moving! But where should we go first? Violet said. Guests have requested assistance in 3 places at once. You'll have to split up, of course, Frank or Ernest replied as unfathomably as ever. Each concierge would choose a guest and hurry to their location. Take the elevators. They're at 118 for force and energy. Excuse me, sir, said another bellboy, tapping Ernest or Frank on the shoulder. There's a banker on the phone who wants to speak to one of the managers right away. I'd better get to work, the manager said, and so should you, concierges. Off with you. Off with you is a phrase used by people who lack the courtesy of saying something more polite, such as, if there's nothing else you require, I must be going. Or, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to ask you to leave, please. Or, even, excuse me, but I believe you have mistaken my home for your own, and my valuable belongings for yours, and I must ask you to return the items in question to me, and leave my home after untying me from this chair, as I'm unable to do it myself, so if it's not too much trouble. The children were not pleased to be dismissed so rudely, nor were they pleased to learn that their employment as concierges would involve such a complicated organizational method in an immense and confusing hotel. They were not pleased that they had not been able to discern which manager was Frank and which was Ernest, and they were not pleased to learn that the Daily Punctilio was alerting the citizens to the Baudelaire's arrival, and that someone might recognize them at any moment and have them arrested for the crimes they had not committed. But most of all, the Baudelaires were not pleased by the notion of splitting up and doing separate errands in this perplexing hotel. They had hoped to perform their duties as concierges and flâniers together, and with each step toward the elevators, they grew more and more unhappy at the idea of leaving one another behind. I'll go to the rooftop sunbathing salon, Violet said, trying to be brave. Klaus, why don't you take room 674? And Sonny, you can take room 371. We'll all meet up at the concierge desk when we're done. We'll be able to observe more this way, Klaus said hopefully. With the 3 of us on 3 separate stories, we can find the imposter much more quickly. Unsafe, Sonny said, which meant something along the lines of, I'd rather not find the imposter if I'm all by myself. You'll be safe, Sonny, Klaus said. This hotel is just like a large library. Yes, Violet said, and what's the worst thing that can happen in a large library? The 2 younger Baudelaires did not answer her, and the 3 concierges stood in silence for a few moments, gazing at a small sign posted near the elevator's sliding doors. When one pair of doors finally opened, the children stepped inside and pressed the appropriate buttons for their guest locations, and as the small elevator began to rise, the children remembered the elevator shaft at 667 Dark Avenue, which had been necessary to climb up and down several times. The Baudelaires had learned the worst thing that could happen in an elevator shaft was being thrown down one by a villainous girlfriend. The Baudelaires had learned the worst thing that could happen at a lumber mill, which was being forced to cause a violent accident through the sinister power of hypnotism. And the Baudelaires had learned the worst thing that could happen at a school, which has meant some dear friends, only to have them dragged away in a long black automobile. The orphans learned that the worst thing was at a herpetologist's house, and what the worst thing was in a small town, and at a hospital, and at a carnival, and at the peak of a mountaintop, and in a submarine, and in a cave, and within the currents of a rushing stream, and inside the trunk of a car, and a pit full of lions, and a secret passageway, and many, many other sinister places they preferred not to think about. And throughout all these perils they had encountered and the countless other perils inside, they'd always found a library of some sort or another where the children managed to discover the crucial information necessary to save their skins, a phrase which here means keep them alive for the next terrible chapter in their lives. But now the Baudelaire's new home was a library, a strange one, of course, but a library nonetheless. And as the elevator took them silently through the library toward their separate destinations, they did not like to wonder what the worst thing was that could happen at a library, particularly after reading the first 4 words on the small posted sign. In case of fire, the sign read, and as the Baudelaire orphans went their separate ways, they did not like to think of that at all. Not a chapter. Literally, that's what this is called. As I'm sure you've noticed, most of the history of the Baudelaire orphans is organized sequentially, a word which here means so that the events in the lives of the Violet, Klaus, and Sunny Baudelaire are related in the order in which they occurred. In the case of the 3 chapters, however, the story is organized simultaneously, which means that you do not have to read the chapters in the order in which they appear. In chapter 4, you may find the story of Violet Baudelaire's journey up to the rooftop sunbathing salon and the unpleasant conversation she had occasion to overhear. In chapter 5, you may read about Klaus's experience with certain members of the lumber industry and a sinister plot that was devised right in front of his nose. And in chapter 6, you may see the result of my research into Sunny's dreadful visit to room 371 and to a mysterious restaurant located on the 9th story. But because of all of them occurring at the very same time, you need not read the chapters in the sequence 4, 5, 6, but can read them in any order you choose. Or more sensibly, you can simply skip all 3 chapters along with the 7 chapters that follow them and find some other sequential or simultaneous thing with which to occupy your time. And that is where we will end for today. And me personally, I might jump around the next 3 chapters to choose, like, who do we read next? Do we read about Violet? Do we read about Klaus next? Do we read about Sunny? And personally, I'm going to probably read about Klaus because he's a middle child. I'm a middle child. Love that concept. So, yeah, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.